Hello, and welcome to the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration's public meeting for the Draft Air Tour Management Plan and Environmental Assessment for Canyon de Chelly National Monument. My name is Michelle Carter. I am an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'm going to be serving as your moderator for the meeting this evening. I'm going to start us off by defining a couple of acronyms that you'll hear us use tonight. You'll hear us refer to the National Park Service as the NPS, the Federal Aviation Administration as the FAA, and the Environmental Assessment as the EA. We'll define some of the other remaining acronyms as we go along. Next slide. We are holding this virtual public meeting to review the draft ATMP for Canyon de Chelly and to take questions on the draft and the EA. Our meeting is being held pursuant to the National Parks Air Tour Management Act of 2000, which is also known as NAPATMA, and its implementing regulations. You're going to hear a little bit more about NAPATMA and the draft ATMP here shortly, along with more information on how you could submit your questions and your official comments. Before we dive into the presentations, I'm going to take a minute and introduce our presenters and provide a little bit more information about meeting logistics and how you can participate. Next slide, please. So joining us this evening as presenters are Eric Elmore, a Senior Policy Advisor with the Office of Environment and Energy from FAA. We also have Vicki Ward, an Overflights Program Manager with the National Park Service, Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division. And then from the park, we have Superintendent Lynn Carranza, and we also have Keith Lyons, who is the park's Integrated Resource Manager and archaeologist. So tonight, Eric and Vicki are first going to provide a brief overview of NAPATMA and the purpose of the meeting. And then we'll hear from Superintendent Carranza and Keith, who are going to share more information about the park's perspective and to discuss park-specific resources in the context of the draft ATMP. Next slide, please. So throughout the meeting, we invite you to submit your questions, and they will be addressed after the presentations as part of our Q&A or question and answer session. We are accepting questions via a Google form, which you can access by either scanning the code on your screen or by clicking a link that I believe our meeting host can drop into the chat. Questions that are submitted through tonight's meeting are going to be considered by the agencies in the development of the ATMP, but we wanted to mention that they're not considered formal comments. Next slide, please. All official comments must be submitted through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment, or we call it the PEPC site, or they should be sent to the mailing addresses that are listed on the park's PEPC site. Only the comments that are received through one of these two avenues will become part of our official record, and they must be submitted by May 3rd at midnight Mountain Time. The agencies are not accepting official comments via email, and we'll share a little bit more information about all of this later in our presentation. Next slide, please. Well, this meeting is being broadcasted on YouTube Live, as I just mentioned. We're going to be accepting questions through that Google form, and I'm not sure if folks may have joined us late, but if so, just in case, if the meeting host could drop the Google form link, maybe in the chat again, just to make sure folks have access to it. Submit your questions using this link, and we're doing it that way to help us manage the question and answer session, and especially if we have the ability to group similar questions together as they come in. And again, later on when the time comes, we will read the questions aloud, and our presenters are going to do their best to respond. Now, depending on how many questions we get, we'll try to get to all of them. But in the event that there's a delay and questions are not coming in, we may take an opportunity to review some of the frequently asked questions that we've received These are posted on the project website, or we may go through a couple of other questions that we've received during other meetings that are relevant to Canyon de Chelly. Our team has set aside 90 minutes for the whole meeting. And I think I mentioned just if after the presentations, if there's a lull, we'll allow you time to keep the questions coming in after you've had a chance to maybe see the responses to some of the questions or think through what you've heard in the presentations. We appreciate you joining us this evening to learn more about the draft ATMP. We will now play a short overview video before turning it over to Eric and Vicki to provide additional details about NAPATMA and why we are here today.
The United States is home to some of the most breathtaking national parks and tribal lands in the world. It is important that we protect these lands while ensuring that the public has ample opportunity to enjoy these national treasures. Air tours offer the public a totally different type of experience. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service work together to manage air tours over national parks. We are developing plans that help protect wildlife, wilderness character, cultural resources, natural soundscapes, and visitor enjoyment. These plans are known as Air Tour Management Plans, and today we will explore the specifics of the draft plan for your park. As part of our planning process, we consult with tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, state and tribal historic preservation officers, and wildlife biologists. We assess noise, wildlife protection, and other environmental considerations, and we will continue to make adjustments to these plans as needed. And we consider the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review for these plans. The FAA and the National Park Service are committed to ensuring safe flights at our national parks while safeguarding park resources. Following today's presentation, we encourage you to review your park's draft Air Tour Management Plan and provide official comments through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. Together, we can celebrate these special places and ensure they can be enjoyed for generations to come.
All right, thank you, Michelle. Welcome everybody. Good evening, at least for me. My name is Eric Elmore. I'm a senior policy advisor with the Federal Aviation Administration. And this evening, I'm going to give a brief overview of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, also known as NAPATMA. So a few things that NAPATMA requires. It requires the FAA, in cooperation with the Park Service, the National Park Service, to develop an air tour management plan for parks where operators applied to conduct commercial air tours. So now, given context, the act was passed in 2000. So when it's talking about the application to conduct air tours, these are things that happened back around 2000. NAPATMA is limited in regards to what we are required to develop plans for and the area in which the law applies. And so the air tour management plan will apply to the park plus a half mile outside of the park. So laterally, you look at the park boundary and you extend that a half mile throughout, and that is the jurisdictional boundary of NAPATMA laterally. Vertically, NAPATMA applies up to 5,000 feet above ground level, AGL as we call it. So as the ground undulates, that 5,000 feet will also undulate, unlike mean sea level. In regards to the next bullet, important fact is that NAPATMA, what it does not apply to. And so the act does not apply to other types of aviation, including general aviation, commercial airlines, military flights, unmanned aircraft, also known as drones, firefighting, and those type of things. It's really limited to commercial air tour operations within that park boundary. And as I said earlier, back in 2000, air tour operators were required to apply for operating authority. At that time, it was known as interim operating authority, or IOA, and that gave them the authorization to continue to operate over the parks until the agencies developed an air tour management plan. Next slide, please. So Congress, the law, and the NEPATMA tells us what the objectives of an air tour management plan are. And that is generally, and in particular for this plan, is to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent the significant adverse impacts. There's a difference between impacts and effects, as I'll explain a little bit later, but significant adverse impacts, if any, of commercial air tour operations on the park's resources and values. Next slide, please. So NEPATMA has some things that you can do, and it has some things that the agencies have to do. And so when we're developing these air tour management plans, as NEPATMA says, an air tour management plan, it may prohibit commercial air tour operations in whole or in part. It can, create other types of conditions, which could be things such as routes, altitudes, time of day restrictions, restrictions for particular events. In this instance, obviously, I think the draft is to have no air tours within the park boundary. And then the mandatory aspects of NEPATMA, kind of reiterating what we talked about earlier, is that it shall apply to all commercial air tour operations within that jurisdictional boundary. An air tour management plan has to include an incentive for QT, except in instances like this where there are no air tours inside the park. And then it shall provide for allocation if that's what it does. And then in this instance, it does not. And finally, it shall justify and document the need for the measures taken, and include such justification in the record of decision. I think I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to my colleague, Vicki Ward.
Thanks, Eric, and hello, everyone. I'm Vicki Ward from the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division in the National Park Service, and my office is located in Fort Collins, Colorado. So I'm going to since I don't know if everybody is on YouTube and if anybody can't see the this particular slide, but this is a map of the continental United States, and it just shows where we have been working on air tour management plans or voluntary agreements for 23 parks, and also one more park that had it with exemption withdrawn since about middle of 2020. Canyon de Chelly is one of our last ones that we're putting out for public review right now. And so with that, just in general, a lot of the TMPs and voluntary agreements that we've worked on for the parks have been mostly concentrated out in the Western US. We had a couple parks in South Dakota, a couple in Hawaii, and then Great Smokies in the East, and also Statue of Liberty, Governor's Island in the Northeast. But by and large, it's most of these are located in the Western US. So you can go to the next slide, please. And then this just lists out in a little larger type all the air tour management plans that we've completed to date. Starting in 2021, we had a lot of public meetings then, and then after that, we had the ATMPs finished. We also finished voluntary agreement for the New York parks, Statue of Liberty and Governor's Island early last year, and then we had an existing voluntary agreement in place with I think it was 5 of the operators or 7 of the operators at Glen Canyon and Rainbow Bridge National Monument, and then last year the remaining 2 operators signed on to that agreement. So that park has been completed too. The other park that we're working on right now is a voluntary agreement process. It's ongoing for Lake Mead National Recreation Area. That actually is out for public review right now, that draft voluntary agreement. It is also on Pepsi, and that public review period closes April 19th, so just in 2 days. And then obviously here we're tonight to talk and present about the air tour management plan for Canyon de Chelly. Go to the next slide. And so as part of this ATMP development, we also follow some processes related to the National Environmental Policy Act, but also some specific requirements that are in the PATMA. And one of those requirements is to publish the proposed air tour management plan in the Federal Register, which was done on April 3rd. And that notice announcing the availability of that. We hold at least one public meeting. Yesterday there was an in-person public meeting. And then obviously tonight is our virtual public meeting for those who could not join in person. And then as part of developing the air tour management plan, we comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and some other legal requirements related to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. And for this ATMP in particular, one of the other requirements was that we worked with the Navajo Nation in several ways. First, they are a sovereign or independent nation in the nation-to-nation consultation with the agencies. The Navajo Nation was also invited to be a cooperating agency as part of the NEPA process. So they cooperated through that process and were engaged in the development of the air tour management plan. And then finally, the nation is also a consulting party for compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So as I previously mentioned, today we're going to review the components of that draft ATMP for the park. And with that, it is time for me to hand it over to Lynn for the next part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicki, and good evening to everybody. I am Lynn Carranza. I am the superintendent of the Southern Four Corners group of parks. That includes Canyon de Chelly, along with Navajo National Monument and Hubble Trading Post National Historic Site. I think that, well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. I think your participation is so important to this process. And I'm very grateful to see that so many of you have joined us this evening. Canyon de Chelly is a unique park within the national park system. The lands within Canyon de Chelly are tribal trust lands. They are not Park Service lands. And as a result, we have to work very closely with the Navajo Nation on everything that we do. There is a community of people that live within the canyon and on the rims of Canyon de Chelly. And there are people who practice agriculture in traditional ways out in the canyon. This plan was particularly important for Canyon de Chelly because the process allows for the community to have a voice in what happens in the park and over the park in this case. The park encompasses approximately 84,000 acres of land within the Defiance Plateau. It's all tribal lands held in trust for the Navajo people. And there are approximately 80 Navajo families that live in and around the park. And on the Navajo Nation, when we talk about a family, we don't talk about a typical mom and dad and 2 children. We talk about extended families, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, children, grandchildren. So a family 80 families could actually be thousands of people wanting to access lands within Canyon de Chelly for purposes of farming, living for part of the year, and recreation themselves. There are specific places and natural features such as Spider Rock, Fortress Rock, and celestial features that are physical expressions of the defining stories and events in the history of the Navajo people. And they retain profound spiritual and sacred significance to the people to this day. Canyon de Chelly is a physical and spiritual home that sustains the families who live in the canyons, as well as a sacred place connecting all Navajo people to their cultural heritage and beliefs. Next slide, please. So this is the location of Canyon de Chelly. You can see that it falls almost perfectly within the center of the Navajo reservation, very close to the Four Corners area, if you're familiar with that area. Next slide, please. And here is a map of the canyon. The park boundary is the black dashed line. The gray line around that is the half-mile distance from the park boundary, which will be talked about more in this presentation. And the other lines, the red line, the green line, the other dotted line, those are the current air tour routes that planes are taking when they're flying over Canyon de Chelly. So again, thank you all for being here and hearing our presentation tonight. I'm going to pass it back over to Eric at this point.
Thank you, Superintendent Carranza. I appreciate that. So to continue on in regards to existing conditions, the last slide gave you a visual of what we had determined the air tour operators' air tour routes would be, as well as some of the altitudes associated with those operations as they relate to the park. And we also had data that was provided through the required air tour operator reporting requirements that also gave us data points as we went through our analysis in this process. When we were looking at existing conditions, again, information data points to know are that back in 2000, when the law was passed, 4 commercial air tour operators applied for interim operating authority, and combined, those 4 operators were provided 175 authorized flights per year over the park. When we started doing the analysis, we looked at the years 2017 through 2019 for a number of reasons. One, it did not include data that took into effect the COVID pandemic when air tour operations and a lot of things were just down. And the accuracy of the reporting that was supplied by operators was definitely much improved from when they first started back in around 2012. So when we looked at the data from 2017 through 2019, the one air tour operator was conducting on average 43 air tour operations per year over the park, and they could have been on any one of those routes that were depicted on the previous slide. One of the issues in regards to the interim operating authority, some people might say, why you got to get rid of interim operating authority? It's because it's supposed to be interim, and it's really not a plan. IOA just really provided a cap on the number of operations that an air tour operator could conduct. Interim operating authority does not say what altitude, what aircraft, what time of day, or any of those type of things that an air tour management could put in place. And so that's why it's important to Congress required us to do air tour management plans. Next slide, please. I'm passing it off to Keith Lyons. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Hello, my name is Keith Lyons, and I'm the Integrated Resource Manager and Archaeologist of Canyon-de-Chelly National Monument. I'll be discussing park-specific resources and the draft ATMP. Canyon-de-Chelly National Monument preserves one of the longest continually inhabited locations by Native American communities in the United States, spanning at least 5,000 years. Sei, the place within the rock, sustains a living community connected to a landscape of great historical and spiritual significance. A landscape composed of places infused with collective memory and defining moments in Navajo history. It is essential to the spiritual and traditional lives and cultural identity of many Native peoples. As you can see in the photograph, the park's colorful red cliffs of the de-Chelly sandstone rise from the wash to heights up to 1,200 feet. Thousands of fragile archaeological resources within the park make up one of the most important and extensive archaeological landscapes in the Southwest. White House Ruin and Spider Rock are examples of two cultural sites within the park that are considered highly sacred by the Navajo people. Fortress Rock, a natural feature and archaeological site, figures prominently in Navajo history and symbolizes survival and endurance in the face of significant adversity. Biodiversity within the park is enormous. The canyon wash, springs, and rich soils support a variety of outstanding plants and wildlife. A variety of avian species may be found within the park, including raptors and migratory birds. Other examples of wildlife include mule deer, mountain lion, coyote, black bear, and even bats. In summary, plants, animals, and humans, past and present, are interconnected within this important, unique, and sensitive canyon ecosystem. Next slide, please. Currently, under the IOA, 175 flights per year are authorized, with no restrictions in place in terms of routes, altitudes, time of day of week, and restrictions for particular events. The draft ATMP proposes to reduce the number of commercial air tours over the park to 0. The establishment of the ATMP will result in the termination of the IOA for the operator at park. Next slide, please. This map illustrates the removal of commercial air tour flight paths over Canyon-de-Chelly. As Lynn mentioned, the park boundary is indicated by the dotted black line, and the ATMP boundary is gray and measures 1/2 mile from the park boundary in all directions. Next slide, please. Justification for measures taken. The provisions and conditions in this ATMP are designed to protect park cultural resources, which necessarily include resources that are culturally and spiritually significant to the Navajo Nation, because the park is located entirely on tribal trust lands. The provisions and conditions in the ATMP protect the confidentiality of sacred sites in the park, which is listed in the National Register of Historic Places in its entirety and contains many traditional cultural properties and other cultural resources that are sacred to the Navajo Nation. To respect the spiritual significance of the park to the Navajo people, to maintain cultural connections to the park, to respect privacy for Navajo people during traditional uses and ceremonies, to respect the privacy of the Navajo people living within the AT&P boundary, and the provisions and conditions in the AT&P prioritize the voices and values of the people of the Navajo Nation, especially those that live within or adjacent to the park. Next slide, please. Allowing commercial air tours within the AT&P boundary is inconsistent with the park's purpose and values, which include perpetuating traditional tribal cultural connections to the park's landscapes. Since commercial air tours would negatively impact the privacy of the Navajo families living within the AT&P boundary and are inconsistent with the park's purpose, significance, and fundamental resources and values, the agencies have decided to prohibit commercial air tours within the AT&P boundary. Thank you. And to you, Eric.
Thanks, Keith. So now I'm going to give a brief overview of NEPA and the 106 National Historic Preservation Act. So NEPA is an acronym for the National Environmental Policy Act, and it is a law that the agencies are required to comply with whenever we have federal action. And in this case, the development of the draft ATM or the ATMP is a federal action that requires us to comply with NEPA, in addition to the fact that NEPATMA specifically requires it. So in complying with NEPA, the agencies have to consider the human and natural environment that could be affected by their action. And in this instance, the action is the ATMP. We are required to determine the appropriate level of NEPA review when we analyze the impacts of those actions. And in this instance, we are conducting an environmental assessment that is available for your review and comment. And finally, the agencies are required to prepare the review documents. And in this instance, we're also required to complete a record of decision or a decision document. Next slide, please. So along with that legal requirement, process requirement, is another legal process requirement, and that is the National Historic Preservation Act. Specifically, Section 106 of that act requires the agencies to undergo a process in which there are 4 steps that are outlined. And as you'll see in this slide, the 4 steps are: first, we are required to define the undertaking and to identify consulting parties. Similar to NEPA, where you have a federal action, under historic preservation, you have an undertaking. And in this instance, the undertaking is the development of the ATMP. In the second step, the agencies are required to determine the area of potential effect, also known as the APE, and to identify the historic properties that are inside of that area of potential effect. Once we do that, the agencies are required to assess the effects of the undertaking on the historic properties. Finally, if there are any adverse effects as a result of the undertaking, then the agencies are required to resolve those adverse effects. In this instance, the agencies have done the process, and at this point, we are proposing, I believe, a finding of no adverse effects. However, we are still undergoing that process. As part of that process, the agencies have consulted with the Navajo Nation, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, the Pueblo of Jemez Tipo Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Native American tribes, and other consulting parties, including operators. Finally, as I said previously, the FAA is proposing a finding of no adverse effect. And that was sent to the State Historic Preservation Officer and all consulting parties, and we're awaiting the conclusion and outcome of the 106 process. At this point, I will hand it off to Michelle to give you an overview of the Section 7 process.
All right, thanks, Eric. So the agencies are also complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, as they develop the draft ATMP. And this is to ensure that the proposed action does not jeopardize the existence of any listed species, species listed under ESA, or result in the destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat. The agencies conducted the Section 7 analysis and determined that the preferred alternative of no air tours would have no effect on listed species or their habitat. Next slide, please. So as noted earlier, we're currently inviting comment from tribal members, other agencies, the general public, and all interested parties on the draft ATMP and EA, and comments must be received by May 3rd. Comments can be submitted one of two ways. I'll probably mention this a couple more times throughout the meeting. They either can be submitted online through the National Park Service public comment website, and you can see the link to that here on the screen, or you can submit them by mail, also to the address on the screen here. If you don't have a chance to jot it down and that's how you want to submit comments, you can also go to the comment website and get that information. The agencies are not accepting comments via email. It also is good to mention that there's a FAQ, or a frequently asked questions document, that's posted on the comment website alongside the draft ATMP and the EA. And so here's where I ask again for one of our hosts to please drop the link to the Pepsi page into the chat. Next slide, please. So following the end of this public comment period, the FAA and the NPS are going to review all of the comments submitted, and they'll consider them as they develop the final ATMP. They'll continue to coordinate and complete consultation under the National Historic Preservation Act and with the tribes. And they will conclude the NEPA process by signing a decision document, and Eric mentioned that, which is the ROD, the Record of a Decision. Once all of this is wrapped up, the ATMP will be considered complete, and it'll be available for viewing on both the FAA and the NPS websites. And finally, FAA will update the operations specifications for each air tour operator. Next slide, please. Okay, and with that, we want to just thank all of the presenters that we heard from this evening. Very informative presentations. And now we're going to turn over to the Q&A portion of the meeting, the question and answer session. If anybody may have joined during the presentations, my name is Michelle Carter. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'm just serving as the moderator for the meeting this evening. A couple of housekeeping items. We want to make sure that everybody knows this meeting is being recorded. Links to the recording and also to the PowerPoint slides that we shared this evening are going to be available on each agency's ATMP website and also on the public comment website. We just first have to make sure that they are compliant with online accessibility requirements. For the question portion of the meeting, if you have a question you'd like to submit, please post it into the Google form. That's using the link that's either shared in the chat area of your YouTube window, or you can use your phone to scan the QR code that you see here on the slide. Our meeting this evening, along with this Q&A session, I just wanted to mention, should be focused on the ATMP for Canyon de Chelly. And we just ask to the extent possible that you can focus your questions specifically on this particular planning effort. If you'd like more information on other ATMPs or other planning efforts, you can visit the FAA or the NPS websites to learn more about the completed plans, and Vicki mentioned some of those earlier. And if one of the meeting hosts happens to have those two websites, and you could drop it in the chat also, that would be appreciated. So those of you out there participating in the meeting, just a reminder, questions that are submitted tonight will be considered by the agencies as they continue developing the ATMP, but they're not considered those formal comments. The formal comments should be submitted through the public comment website or sent to the mailing address, both displayed here on the slide. And another broken record reminder that comments need to be received by May 3rd. The website closes down at midnight Mountain Time. Again, I mentioned this in the beginning of the meeting, but we've set aside a total of 90 minutes for our time with you. We'll adjourn no later than 7:30 Mountain Time. In the event that we get through questions and they're addressed, we'll continue to hold the meeting open for a while, just to allow additional questions to come in after you've had a chance to reflect on the presentations or think about some of the responses you may have heard to the questions that have been asked tonight. And also, just in the event that there's a delay in questions coming in, we may walk through some of the other questions we've received, either on the frequently asked questions website or some of the other questions we've received during other public comment periods that are applicable across all of the planning efforts. So with that, I am going to move over to the questions. It looks like we've had quite a few coming in. And I think we will go ahead and start with a question for Eric here. Eric, all right, so this question is asking, what is the FAA's definition of sacred airspace? Where is that definition found in writing? And what are the dimensions of sacred airspace? How high and how wide?
Okay, first, thank you for the question. So the Federal Aviation Administration does not have a definition for sacred airspace. However, as part of the complying with the Section 106 process, what we do have is, as we discussed a little bit earlier, is called the area of potential effect. And that's how we are required to look at the effects of the undertaking under Section 106. And so in establishing that APE, we sought to include any of the historic properties that were present. As I said, as one of the steps, we have to identify the properties that could be affected. And we looked at things, noise impacts, visual impacts, all kinds of different impacts of air tour operations on those historic properties. And that's how we analyzed and came up with our, did our 106 process analysis. So hopefully that was helpful. We don't have a definition of sacred airspace, but that's how we did our 106 analysis. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to go ahead and see what we have coming in here. Apologize to those of you out here. Sometimes there is a little bit of a lag, but okay, it looks like actually, Keith, we have a question here for you. And Keith, the question is asking, has the NPS performed any studies to compare the cumulative adverse impact of ground tours in the canyon to those of air tours? They're asking, would hundreds of ground tours per month lasting approximately 2.5 hours each have more adverse impact than 10 flights per month over the park, flown as mere transportation flights at 2,000 feet above ground level, lasting 5 minutes each? There's a lot to unpack there, Keith, but I'll have you take that one away.
Great. Thank you for the question. I'm not aware of a study comparing the impacts of ground tours in the canyon to air tours. Visitors can tour the park's canyon only by hiking, horseback, or vehicle with an authorized Navajo guide, and after obtaining a backcountry permit from the Navajo Nation's Park and Recreation Department and the NPS. In general, ground tours have more limited visibility than air tours. The tour businesses, as are all businesses operating on the Navajo Nation, or permitted by the Navajo Nation and follow conditions of those permits. I hope that answers your questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Keith. I'm going to go ahead and take this next one over to Eric. Eric, this question is asking, how is it possible for a fixed wing plane flying a half-mile offset from the canyon to inflict more invasion of privacy on residents in the park than thousands of tourists per month taking pictures with telephoto lenses from the back of commercial ground tour vehicles on half-day outings? It's also like a little bit to unpack there.
All right, so I thank you for the question. So that was a lot. So it sounds like in general, the question is seeking like how do we do a comparison, I guess, of impacts from an air tour? How do we say that's more impact from a commercial air tour than ground visitors? And I guess my response to that is we didn't have to do that analysis. And the POTMA requires us, right, as I pointed out earlier, it's confined to regulating commercial air tours over national parks. And that's what we focused on. And so what our analysis looked at was the impacts of commercial air tours on park resources. And so again, we went through a number of processes. One of those processes is the 106 process that we talked about, and that's called the 106 consultation process. And during that process, we received information, observations from tribal members saying that they're having difficulty carrying out their traditional activities such as farming and other daily activities around their residences, impacting their religious ceremonies, invading the privacy of those carrying out these activities, and how that diminishes the connections, their connections to the sacred landscape. Additionally, we discussed with the 5 Navajo Nation chapters that represent the Navajo people that live in and around the park, and those chapters passed resolutions opposing commercial air tours over the park. We received a letter from the president of the Navajo Nation also supporting that. And so those are things that kind of informed our decision in regards to what the impacts are from commercial air tours. Again, it's a unique park. It is Navajo Nation Park that the park sits on. And so it's these things are very important. And so that is kind of the scope that we were confined to look at in our analysis, and not necessarily as a comparison to impacts from ground traffic. So I hope that answers your question. And thank you.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Okay, I think this next question we'll send it over to Superintendent Carranza. So it looks like there's a couple of parts to this question. It's asking, first of all, how many ground tour operators are licensed to conduct air tours in the park? On average, how many ground tours are conducted in the canyon during the summer months? And what is the average total passenger count per year on all ground tours for the last 2 years? An average annual total passenger counts. So Lynn, if you can take that one.
Sure, thank you for that question. So currently there are 11 companies that have been permitted by the Navajo Nation to do ground tours. Those include vehicle tours, horse tours, and hiking tours. people visiting Canyon de Chelly must enter the canyon with a Navajo guide. And so the tours are the way that people can actually tour the canyon. Since the permits, the backcountry permits, are issued also by the Navajo Nation Department of Parks and Recreation, they are the ones who keep the statistics on the numbers of people that are touring. So at this time, we don't have those statistics. The National Park Service does not have those statistics. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Lynn. Okay, coming back over to Eric again. So Eric, this question is asking if air tour companies were owned by Navajos, would the tribe have the same objections as against other air tours?
If, I'm sorry, you said if the tribe owned the commercial air tour?
Yeah, if air tour companies were owned by Navajos, would the tribe have the same objections against air tours?
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I would say that I can't, and the agency can't speak for the Navajo Nation or the Navajo people in whether or not what their position on that would be. So we only know what they told us as part of the process that's ongoing right now. And what they told us is they don't want commercial air tour operations over the park. So I don't know if that would have changed their mind or not. Thank you for the question.
Eric, I'm going to come back over to you. And this question is asking, why did the FAA and NPS not offer any of the air tour operators at the park the possibility of a voluntary agreement?
Why didn't the agencies offer an opportunity for a voluntary agreement at the park? That was the question. So first, thank you for the question. So one, the agencies, as probably known, are under a court order that required the agencies to complete 23 bring 23 parks into compliance with the National Parks Air Tour Management Act in a period of 2 years. And so for this park, the agencies agreed that the best and most efficient tool under NAPATMA in order to bring it into compliance is an air tour management plan. So that was the decision the agencies made to come into compliance. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, well, we'll have Vicky come on for this next question. Now, the question is, why is the standards for notification of tribal ceremonies in Canyon de Chelly different from those of Arches, Canyonlands, Bryce Canyon, Lake Mead, Glen Canyon, and Rainbow Bridge? And why is the standard of privacy so much higher for one tribe than all of the others in the Southwest?
Okay, thanks for that question. Each park is considered independently and in consultation with the associated tribes and parks resources. So as you can imagine, different tribes are going to have different views about different aspects of the park's resources, their cultures, etc. And as we've mentioned before, Canyon de Chelly is located entirely on lands held in trust by the United States for the Navajo Nation. And because of the tribal interests implicated by the park's unique location on tribal trust lands, The impacts from commercial air tours cannot be mitigated, since commercial air tours would negatively impact the privacy of the Navajo families living within the ATMP boundary and are inconsistent with the park's purpose, significance, and fundamental resources and values. The agencies have decided to prohibit commercial air tours within the ATMP boundary. And thanks. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. Okay, the next question is for Superintendent Carranza. The person is asking how many complaints the NPS received against fixed wing air tours over the canyon in the last 5 years, and whether or not those are documented.
So I don't have this information available for the meeting tonight. I do regularly get complaints from people who feel that the aircraft have flown over very close and have disturbed them. In the last 5 years, because of the pandemic and because the Navajo Nation was closed, we didn't receive a lot of complaints. But in the past few months, I have received a couple of complaints. But in terms of the period of time before the pandemic, I would have to look at that, and that would have been before 5 years ago. So we have just lived through a unique time that impacted the Navajo Nation pretty dramatically, and the Navajo Nation was closed. So many of us were working from home. A lot of the visitor center wasn't open for a lot of that time because visitors were asked not to come to the Navajo Nation. So documenting those kinds of events would have been very challenging over the past 5 years. Thank you for that question. Sorry I couldn't answer that more completely at this time.
Eric, I'm going to ask this next question of you, and if there's anybody else that wants to chime in afterwards, they certainly can do so. But Eric, this question is asking how many times has the NPS at Canyon de Chelly called air tour operators in the last 20 years to discuss possible adverse impacts of air tours on the local people of the park and on the cultural resources therein? And if not, why not?
I was going to defer to the Park Service because I don't know if FAA would have that data. I don't know if NPS has that data. But what I can say in regards to contacting the operators is that, again, as part of the processes in developing the ATMP as part of the 106 process in particular, that both agencies, were working together, and we reached out to the operators to discuss the undertaking and the impacts of the commercial air tours on historic properties and cultural resources. So Park Service, I don't know if you can answer the first part or not, but that's the best I got for you.
I'm not sure we actually have any more to add at this time. If there's additional clarification that the person submitting the question would like, feel free to go ahead and submit another question in there. And that's as with any of the questions that we answer. If there's additional clarification, if folks out there would like that, feel free to submit that question, the updated question. But I think I'll go ahead and move along here. Vicki, we're gonna take this next question over to you. And what it is starts out by saying, on December 5th, 2003, Mr. Carl Slater, representing the Navajo Nation, testified before the House Natural Resources Subcommittee that one of the major objections that the tribe had against air tours at Canyon de Chelly was the fact that Navajos did not own the air tour companies. And they're asking, Do the FAA and NPS acknowledge this as a legitimate reason to ban all air tours and transportation flights by air tour operators that are not Navajo?
Thanks for that question. Because commercial air tours would negatively impact the privacy of the Navajo families living with the AT&P boundary and are inconsistent with the park's purpose, significance, and fundamental values and resources. This was the reason the agencies decided to prohibit commercial air tours within the AT&P boundary. The agencies did not make this decision based on the ownership of any given air tour company. Thanks. Hope that answers the question.
Okay. And Vicky, I think I'll have you stay on here. This next question is, let's see, it's about Rainbow Bridge. It's asking, it says Rainbow Bridge is considered by the tribes to be one of the most sacred natural landmarks in the Southwest. At that unit of the NPS, the agencies have adopted a VA. Why is Canyon de Chelly any different, or why is it more sacred?
Well, that's an interesting question. But FAA and NPS, we really can't speak for the Navajo people regarding comparisons of Canyon de Chelly and Rainbow Bridge regarding how they view them and if they view them any differently in terms of sacredness. Thanks for that question, though.
Okay, thanks, Vicki. Okay, Eric, we'll have you go through the next two questions. So the first question is asking, why are regular charter flights allowed over the park, but not air tour transportation flights that are engaged in straight line interstate commerce?
So thank you for the question, and I remembered to come off mute this time. I say first, charter flights are not commercial air tours, and therefore they're not regulated under NAPATMA. In regards to commercial air tours in transportation, I'm not sure what that means or what the commenter means per se in that. What I do know, what the agencies know, is that a commercial air tour is defined by, NAPATMA, and that is a commercial air tour that operates within that airspace, within a half mile outside of the park boundary, up to 5,000 feet AGL. And then in particular, like, there are factors that the agencies look at when trying to determine whether or not a flight is a commercial air tour, whether it's held out for that purpose and other factors that are outlined in the CFR. And finally, I would say, the information that we got was based on operator provided reporting data in regards to they self-reported that those flights were commercial air tours. So that's what we deem them to be. But thank you for the question.
Okay, and this next one looks to be kind of just like a follow-up, maybe like piggybacking on that and or a clarification of something that was said earlier. So they're noting that you mentioned that the lone air tour operator only conducts an average of 43 air tours over the park in any given year. They say that computes to 4 flights a month or 1 flight per week. How many of these are actual air tours and how many are merely transportation flights that happen to capture the air tour operator? And in any case, why is only 1 very short flight per week worse than hundreds of ground tours per week in the same canyons?
Right. So thank you for this question. Again, I somewhat think maybe saw it coming, responded. So In regards to the 43 flights and all, and the average of 4 a day, and whether or not they were commercial air tours or not, that's what the commercial air tour operator reported, as they are required to do under NAPATMA. And so that's what we took them to be. And again, in regards to, whether or not, how do we compare, I guess, the apples of commercial air tour impacts to the oranges of ground-based impacts? NAPATMA doesn't require us to regulate ground-based impacts. Again, it's very narrowly focused law that only requires us to regulate commercial air tours. Again, it doesn't regulate, as I said, general aviation, commercial en route traffic, other air activity that could occur that is not a commercial air tour. So that's what Congress told us to do, and that's what we're only allowed to do. So thank you for that question.
It looks like we have a little bit of a lull with the new questions coming in. So as I mentioned earlier, if we had time, which we do, it's just 10 after the hour, that we may walk through a couple of other questions that we received either through the frequently asked questions or some of the other recent planning efforts. So I'm going to walk us through, I think, a couple of these here. And Eric, I know you've been talking a lot, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to go ahead and throw this one back over to you. This is kind of like a basic question, like overarching, and they're asking what the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, or what is the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, and what does it require?
Oh, so it's a lot, and we're trying to hopefully answer, a lot of those, drill down to some of the specific, requirements of NAPATMA. Again, it was passed in 2000. It was passed in order to protect park resources from the impacts of commercial air tour operations. The agencies were supposed to complete air tour management plans, within 2 years of granting them the operating authority to operate in the various parks. We were unable to do so for some 20 years. We ultimately got sued. And so we're under court order to comply. And so it requires us to develop air tour management plans or voluntary agreements, protect park resources, conduct one public meeting, allow for public comments on the ATMP, which we're doing here, comply with NEPA. Because it's a federal action, it requires, it's a lot of dominoes, but in general, develop ways to mitigate the adverse impacts from commercial air tours, prevent significant or mitigate existing or prevent future significant adverse impacts from commercial air tours. So hopefully that's high level enough response. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I realized after I read the question and thought through some of that may have been one of the questions I picked that was a little redundant. So sorry for that, but appreciate the response regardless. Thank you. Okay, this next one we'll toss over to Vicky, and it's asking, why are some parks with air tours not required to have ATMPs or voluntary agreements?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Michelle. The National Parks Air Tour Management Act exempts parks with 50 or fewer reported commercial air tours each year from the requirement to develop an ATMP or a voluntary agreement. So we have, prior to the lawsuit, we had about 78 parks that had interim operating authority for anywhere from 1 to 8 or 9 operators per park. So based on the reports that were implemented. That requirement was implemented in 2013. We started getting data in, and based on those reports, there's about 54 parks where operators hold interim operating authority, and the reported air tours are below 50. So those are exempt from needing an ATMP or a volunteer agreement. The number fluctuates a little bit just because some parks might be a little bit over, maybe go over 1 year and then, it goes back down below, 50 other years. However, the Act does require the NPS director to withdraw the exemption and develop an ATMP or a voluntary agreement if the Park Service determines that an ATMP or an agreement is necessary to protect the park resources and visitor experience. So we have, we being the National Park Service has withdrawn the exemption for a couple parks that were below 50 reported tours. Muir Woods was one of them, which was included in the Bay Area ATMP. Also, the Canyon de Chelly. Obviously, you saw, we've talked about earlier how the average over 3 years was 43. In 2017, the NPS decided that due to the tribal, this being Canyon de Chelly being, held in trust for the Navajo Nation and, with Navajo families on there, that this exemption would be withdrawn and we would develop an ATMP. So, and that's what we're, here at the end of this process with the 24 parks. So, and obviously we did air tour management plans or agreements for about, 24 other or 23 other of the other parks. So, and in future years, we'll probably have some parks that need ATMPs too, if they're become over 50 tours per year. Just wanted to note too that, and I think Eric already mentioned this, but this legislation doesn't cover Alaska. So air tours that are, being conducted in Alaska parks, that are landing in parks, those are actually covered by generally concessions contracts or some other permitting through the National Park Service. And then air tours over Grand Canyon National Park are subject to separate legislation. They have allocations there. There's a special flight rules area for routes over Grand Canyon. So there's several different ways that air tours are managed over national parks. And hope that gives a little more insight into why some parks need ATMPs or voluntary agreements and why some don't. And if you have any more questions on that, just drop it into the question document and we'll take a look at it. Thanks.
Thanks, Vicki. And I think Superintendent Carranza might have a little bit more to add on to that.
Oh, sure. Yes. Go. Yeah.
Sure. So in 2017, when this came up, and I was told that Canyon de Chelly could be exempt from having to do an ATMP, as I do with almost every issue that comes up at Canyon de Chelly, I felt that I needed to reach out to the Navajo Nation. So I did. I reached out to the Navajo Nation Department of Transportation and had a conversation with them about this. And at that time, we decided that this needed to be discussed further and that a plan probably should be done for Canyon de Chelly because of the number of people who live within the canyon and because of the significance, the sacred nature of Canyon de Chelly to the Navajo people. So I hope that answers that a little bit better for you.
Yeah, and that's important clarification. Thanks for coming back on, Lynn. Okay, we have two more questions here that I think that we have time for. There's not a lot of new questions coming in, so we'll go ahead and wrap up with these last two. Eric, the first one is for you. It's asking what happens to an operator's interim operating authority, or IOA, after the ATMP is established.
Thanks, Michelle. So I apologize. This is one of the points maybe I didn't cover when I was doing my overview of NAPATMA. And so, again, one of the provisions that NAPATMA expressly has is that it states that IOA terminates 180 days after the effective date of the air tour management plan. And so after that time, after that 180 days, so once the ATMP is finalized and signed, after we go through this process and whatever that final ATMP is, right now we have this draft proposed one. When it's signed and becomes established, then we have 180 days, and the department says that IOA terminates after that. Again, as with other things, there's an internal process that the FAA has to go through in order to update the operator's op specs. But in essence, the operator would still be able to conduct commercial air tours up until, I guess, the end of that 180-day period, or when their op specs is amended, and that would happen no later than 180 days after the effective date. So, great question. Thank you.
Okay, and then the last one that we have here, just confirming there's no new ones coming in. So, okay, the last question, Vicki, if you don't mind taking this one. Of all of the alternatives considered, why was no air tours selected?
Okay, yeah, thanks. And I think this will kind of give a little overview of what was discussed during the presentation. In this environmental assessment, two alternatives were considered and analyzed, and which was the no action and the no air tours, which means no air tours over the planning area with below 5,000 feet or within half mile of the park boundary. And so in that air tour management plan, we need to provide a justification why we chose the ATMP we did, and which obviously was the no air tours. And so these reasons include, provides the greatest level of protection for the purposes, resource, and values of the park. And because the park is located entirely on the Navajo Nation's tribal trust lands, it best safeguards tribal resources and interests. The draft air tour management plan also supports NPS management objectives consistent with the co-management relationship that NPS has with the Navajo Nation regarding specific decisions involving the monument. So in making those management decisions about the monument, the NPS gave due consideration to the nation's concerns about the impacts of commercial air tours on the monument. The provisions and conditions in the draft ATMP protect the confidentiality of sacred sites in the park, which is listed in the National Register in its entirety and contains many traditional cultural properties and other cultural resources that are sacred to the Navajo Nation. It respects the spiritual significance of the park to the Navajo people, maintains cultural connections to the park, respects the privacy for Navajo people during traditional uses and ceremonies, and respects the privacy of the Navajo people living within the ATMP boundary, and prioritizes the voices and values of the people of the Navajo Nation, especially those that live within or adjacent to the park. And this is unique out of all the ATMPs that we've done so far. All the parks have different resources and values, but this, Canyon de Chelly was, very different from all the other parks in this respect. So I think that covers that. Michelle, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Vicki. All right, well, with that, we are coming to the end of our meeting, and I'd like to turn it over to Superintendent Carranza for some closing remarks before I close this out.
Thank you, Michelle. Again, I'd like to thank everybody who participated in this presentation, all of the presenters, and all of the participants for being here. This is an important process. This is a very meaningful process to the people who live in Canyon de Chelly, and all of these plans require very careful consideration, but particularly Canyon de Chelly in its uniqueness with its community of people living there, and the significance of the sites within Canyon de Chelly, the sacredness of Canyon de Chelly to the people of the Navajo Nation. This was a critical process, and your questions were great. Those are important questions to consider and answer. So I appreciate all of the questions that came in this evening and the opportunity to answer those for you. Thank you so much. And everybody have a good evening. And I'll turn it back over to Michelle to close us out.
Thank you so much. Okay, as we wrap up tonight, I wanted to mention for anybody that may have joined in the middle of the meeting that there is a FAQ frequently asked questions document that's posted with the draft ATMP and EA on the public comment website. You'll see that listed here on the screen. The meeting was recorded, and once the closed captions have been applied, you'll be able to view the recording by visiting the links on the NPS and the FAA ATMP websites. As a reminder, all of the formal comments that you would like for the agencies to consider must either be submitted through the public comment website, the Pepsi website, or sent to the mailing address that's listed here on the screen. And another reminder that the deadline for comments is May 3rd. So on behalf of the FAA and the NPS, we want to thank you for your participation. We look forward to hearing from you. And with that, have a great rest of your evening. Take care.